Great. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another webinar by ETSAP, hosted by UCL. So thanks, Paul, for all the arrangements. So this time, Vangelis Panos will go into the details of the ancillary services markets in times and how they can be modeled. So Vangelis, it's up to you.
Thank you, George, and welcome everyone to this presentation on this extension of times on ancillary services markets. One moment, why it doesn't go down? Okay, so what happens when we have a power outage in the grid? And this is a photo from 2014 in Sweden, where wind turbines were frozen and were, of course, out of the grid. And this is quite funny because a helicopter is putting some water there to start operating again. So this causes instability to the grid frequency, despite the fact, of course, that there is an imbalance between demand and supply. So the aim of this extension is to improve this feature of times in order to enhance the reliability and the security of the energy system. This is one aim. The second is that to capture better the integration costs of renewable energy. The third objective was to develop a market-based mechanism for flexibility. I have to remind here that Times has already technical measures for flexibility. For instance, the residual load curves, which considers some bounds forcing some flexible capacities to be installed. And also we have peaking constraints and ramping rates, but this is a market-based mechanism, which means that we have a mechanism to remunerate capacity for new flexibility. So that was the main objectives of this extension. As you can understand, this directly affects the investment decisions of Times as well as the resultant energy system costs. This extension can be combined with existing extensions of Times and including the dispatching features extension, the grid extension, and as I mentioned before, the residual load curve extension. And this improves in combination with these extensions the Times investments and operational decisions, as we are going to see in an example towards the end of this presentation. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to ancillary services markets before describing the key features and assumptions that we took on implementing this extension. So one key concept here is the concept of the operating reserve capacity. In fact, the electricity system has two main balance constraints. It balances the supply and the demand of energy, of course, and also the operational reserve capacity for short-term imbalances. And these short-term imbalances can occur at the network load side. For instance, when there is a mismatch in the forecasted demand, or in the production side, like the example that we saw before with the wind turbine, when a power plant suddenly goes out of the grid. And basically, what we see here on the right is a power plant operating at a level which is defined by the variable var online. So at var online, this is the online capacity of this power plant, which has been, of course, to be above the minimum operating level. And there is also the maximum capacity defined by the var cap and the available capacity, which is the product between var cap and NCAP AF. Now, this area between var online and the maximum available capacity can be defined as upward operating reserve capacity that allows the power plant to ramp up when it's needed in order to provide for a very short time the required power to the grid in order to stabilize the grid and also to balance again the energy and supply demand in the case of imbalance. Similarly, you see another yellow area towards to the minimum stable operating level, and this is the downward operating reserve capacity, which means that a part of the generating capacity of the power plant is reserved. So the power plant doesn't go when it ramps down into this yellow area, but this area is reserved in order the power plant to provide a downward reserve capacity. So here we have two types of operating reserve: upwards, when the power plant needs to increase the production, and downward, when the power plant needs to reduce the production. And this is the case, for instance, when we have excess of supply or or a mismatch in the forecasted demand. We have lower demand than we were expected. So this is the operating reserve capacity, and it's called operating because this reserve capacity is employed when the power plant operates. And there are 6 types. Now you see 3, but I'm going to tell why it's 6 in a while. So there are different types of operating reserve capacity. The first, and these types actually are differentiated according to their activation time. So the fastest operating reserve capacity is called frequency containment reserve, or FCR. It should be activated automatically in seconds. So this means that this type of reserve can be provided by really fast ramp units. Then we have the second type of reserve, which is activated again in seconds, but not so fast as the FCR. This is called automatic frequency restoration reserve. And it's activated after the FCR to relieve the units that provided FCR, because these units need to go back to the electricity production, to the electricity market. So additional units are coming online to continue to provide operating reserve if this is needed. And this can be automatic or it can be manual. And the third one is the so-called replacement reserve, which is activated after the FRR. And this has an activation time of hour. So if the disruption in the grid or in the supply-demand balance is longer than some minutes, then the FRR units are relieved. They go back to the electricity market, and additional units providing the replacement reserve are coming into the reserve market. The RRR, the replacement reserve, is not always implemented by all TSOs. This reserve, the onomatology of these reserves follows the ENTSO-E convention. There are also other names for them, like primary control reserve, this is the FCR, or secondary control reserve, this is the automatic FCR, or tertiary control reserve, this is the manual FCR. And the reserve can be positive, as we saw before, or negative. Positive when there is a shortage of supply and we need to increase the production capacity, or negative when is excess of supply and we need to reduce the production capacity. It follows that negative reserve can also be provided by demand units. For instance, from a heat pump, when there is excess supply, then we can employ additional demand devices to absorb this excess electricity. This is a negative reserve, and this can be provided by the demand devices. As I said before, heat pumps or batteries at the demand side. So let's see a practical example of how all these reserves are coordinating and are linking together. So I will try to put my pointer. Okay, good. So let's assume that we are in a normal operation of the European grid. This means that the grid operates at the 50 Hertz frequency. And suddenly, in France, a power plant goes down. What is happening in this case is that there is instability in the grid. So you see here that this power plant was providing a power of 1.2 gigawatt. And then for half a minute almost, this power is lost, and this causes a drop in the frequency, which is not good. And what is happening at that time? despite that we lose 1 gigawatt from the supply. What is happening in this time is that the primary control, the FCR, is activated automatically from very fast ramping units across all Europe. And let's say in this example that this lasts for about 5 minutes. During this, prevents the grid to go below the 49.9 hertz, so it maintains a relative stability to the grid. And of course, this involves, as I said before, plants across all the NSOE area. And of course, you cannot reserve these plants for a long time. That's why after 5 minutes, these plants provided the primary control are relieved, are leaving the reserve market, and power plants inside France, the area, the control area, as we said, where this outage occurred, these plants now are providing the secondary control reserve, the FRR reserve, the automatic FRR reserve. And this can be provided, let's say, for a longer time, let's say for 15 minutes. And if the grid has not been yet stabilized entirely, then after these 15 minutes, these power plants are relieved, are going back to the electricity market and not anymore to the reserve market. And the power plants contracted for the provision of tertiary control reserve are coming into the reserve market to continue providing the reserve capacity, reserve power to the grid as long as it's needed in order to regain back to the 50 hertz. So as you can see, there is a hierarchy on how these reserves are activated. First comes the very quick reserve, the FCR primary, then the secondary, which is for a longer period of time, and then the tertiary. So one key point here is how we calculate the demand for reserve requirements. And this is very complex and can differ between countries, and it can be different for reserve types. Usually is a mix between deterministic and probabilistic approaches. Now I'm going to show to you a very scary picture, but I'm not going to go into the details. So this is a real example. This is the Belgian TSO, how it calculates the reserves. And basically what you can get from this picture is that these reserves are calculated based on the forecast errors of solar PV, of wind, of some outages, and other imbalances into the system. These are all probability distributions that are joint. They create a complete joint distribution of all these imbalances of the system. And then what we try to do is that to set the power of reserve demand to that point in this distribution where we lose about 1% of the load, so that we cover 90% of this distribution that we are able to meet, and we have a probability, let's say, of 1% to lose the load. At that point, we set the reserve demand. But I will come back into that. So, what I'm trying to show here is that it's quite a complex procedure. So let's deciphering a little bit this complex procedure. The deterministic component of this demand calculation usually is equal to the loss of the largest single grid element. And this can be a power plant, it can be a grid transformer, a grid power line, and it's calculated both for negative and positive reserve. Also, sometimes this deterministic component is used to determine the reserve which is outside the control area of the country. And I will give an example on that. In NSOE control area in the European grid, the FCR, this is the fast activated or primary control reserve, is not defined by the countries per se. This is defined by NSOE because maybe you remember in the picture that when this happens, all the European plants need to go and to provide it. So this needs to be defined centrally, and NSOE defines that. And each country in NSOE area has a specific contribution to this reserve. And this is fixed. This is defined by NSOE. It's outside the scope of the country. Usually this is 3 gigawatt and contains the N-2 criterion, which means that ENTSO-E considers for this the largest 2 elements in European grid. So this 3 gigawatt, that is the FCR, is allocated to the different countries based on some algorithm that ENTSO-E applies. And this is the allocation for 2018, what you see in this graph, where Germany needs to provide 600 megawatt, France 560, Greece 56, and so on. So this depends on the size of the country. This is, for us, this will be a deterministic approach, because when we're getting a national model, this will be given. Then we have the probabilistic component of the demand calculation. And this probabilistic component, as I said a little bit before, is based on the forecast errors. And this can be calculated based on the historical time series also of the system imbalances when these are occurring. And it's represented as a probability density function. So what we, as I said before, what we care here in this probability function is that the total contracted reserve covers at least 90% of this PDF. So let's see a little bit what is happening here. Here we have the secondary and the tertiary reserve and the replacement reserve. And as we can see, the secondary reserve covers 1 standard deviation, let's say, on the forecast error that we do in the wind and solar production. The tertiary reserve covers from this point to this point. So this is, let's say, 2 standard deviations of the forecast error. And the RRR, the replacement reserve, covers 3 standard deviations from here to here, which is 90% of the distribution. So to set the demand for the secondary reserve, I move 1 standard deviation from the forecast error. So at this point, I set the demand for my secondary reserve. At this point, I set the demand for my tertiary reserve. And at this point, I set the demand for my replacement reserve. And this we have seen it in a more simplified way. What is important here that when the provision reserve comes from a non-storage unit, what it comes into the play is what is the minimum stable operating level of the unit and what are the ramping rates for energy production and consequently the ramping rates for reserve provision. So we need these dispatching parameters also to have into our modeling framework, the minimum stable operating level and the ramping rate. And when the reserve provision is provided, when the reserve is provided from storage, then we need to consider the fact that the storage needs to ramp up for some point in time in order to have enough energy to provide a reserve provision of power P, and then this energy needs to be also enough in order to give this power to the grid, to the reserve market for a certain point in time. So the energy that the storage needs to have is the area under the triangle and the area under the square. This is the assumption also that we will take into the extension of time. So when a storage will go to the reserve market, we need to specify how much time it needs to ramp up the energy stored so that it can provide power P, and then how much energy needs to be charged in order to continue this provision of P for a certain point of time. And here comes a question: what is the difference between the planning reserve margin and the ancillary reserves markets? The planning reserve margin is the peak constraint that we have in times. And actually, this is basically defined as a long-term forecast of the demand. And we give that as a percentage of the median peak load. And you can see here how the peak reserve margin or the planning reserve margin is calculated by TS. So this is a very simplified again approach, but it gives the notion behind. So up to here, up to 100%, this is our generating capacity. Then we increase this generating capacity with what we called load above 1 in 2 peak. What does this mean? Is that to have 50% probability that the forecast peak will be less than the actual peak load, and 50% probability that the forecast peak will be greater than the actual peak load. So we increase, let's say here, by additional. Then we account for forced outage rates, and then with some hydro and thermal derate. And we set the planning reserve margin to something like 17%, let's say. This, however, ensures the reliability on the long-term forecast. The ancillary services markets, we can say that there are quick fixes of the system imbalances that are balancing the short-term forecast of the demand. So in that case, when something happens, let's say for 1 day, you don't have the luxury to get a new investment in a capacity. So the planning reserve margin has the long-term investment operating decisions, influences the long-term investment operating decisions. The ancillary service markets influences the short-term operational decisions. So this is a brief overview to the ancillary services markets. And now I'm going to describe the key features of this time extension. And basically, I will focus on how the demand is given to times, and it's endogenous also, and how the supply of ancillary services markets is modeled into times. But first, I will set the assumptions of our implementation. The implementation has been done by ANTI, of course. We model the provision, not the activation of the reserve, because the activation of reserve requires a fully stochastic framework. We assume a perfect competitive market here. As times operates also as a perfect competitive market. Each reserve is a times commodity, a normal times commodity, defined by the user, whatever name the user wants to give. Of course, when we talk about reserve provision, means that we just have the capacity available to provide the reserve. So there is no consumption related to the reserve provision. The consumption, the fuel consumption, relates only when the reserve is activated. And this we don't model it. And the price of reserve will come as the marginal cost, the shadow price of the ECOMBAL M from the commodity balance, as every other normal commodity of times. Besides, because it's a normal, the reserve is a normal commodity in times, it can be traded between different regions. So we can trade the ancillary service. We can have trade, cross-border trade in ancillary services market. All the user constraint mechanisms that are for commodities are also applicable for reserve commodities. This gives great flexibility. It doesn't need to have a particular time slice tree. You can also have an annual level only and model this extension. Of course, the insights that are going to be get are richer when the time slice tree has more time slices. And also, not all types of reserve need to be modeled. I mean, we have seen 3 types of reserve, a primary, secondary, tertiary, and the 4th one, replacement reserve. So there are 4. We don't need all these 4 as long as we respect the activation hierarchy. So we can model, for instance, primary and secondary, but we cannot model secondary without modeling the primary. Oop, what I did? Okay. Oh, sorry. It was a wrong slide in my PowerPoint. So how to define the operational reserve commodities? There is a particular VEDA parameter for doing this. This is called BS balancing services R type, reserve type. And it can take the values 1 to 4, negative or positive. And if we give 1, then we talk about an FCR type of reserve, a very fast activated. If it is -1, it's a negative reserve. If it is 2, is an automatically frequency restoration reserve. So this is a secondary reserve. If it is 3, it's a tertiary reserve, MFRR. And if it is 4, it's an RR. And this we can normally place it into an insert table in times. And these names here is my names. We can have here whatever names we want. Important for times to allocate that this name of commodity is a particular type of reserve is what number we give here. So 1 means very fast reserve, primary, 2 means secondary reserve, 3 here means primary reserve. So here, I'm sorry, there is a typo. This should be MFRR plus MFRR minus. And the demand for reserve in times also follows this general approach that it has a deterministic component and a probabilistic component. And the deterministic component, it can be exogenous. The user can give it as a fixed amount per year or per time slice, or it can be endogenous. The times can calculate it. And the probabilistic component, it can be similarly exogenous based on historical forecast error, or endogenous with dynamically adjusted forecast errors. We will come into that details. Important here is that the demand for reserve in times, it can have any combination of deterministic and probabilistic components. So it can be said to be the maximum of the two, or a weighted sum of the two, or the difference of the two, or even only deterministic or only probabilistic. The user is fully flexible to define the demand for reserve in the best way that matches the national market that the user is modeling. And now I'm going to give a little bit details on how the deterministic component of the demand can be calculated by times. So as I said before, the deterministic component can be exogenously defined. Remember that there is the case of NSOE, which defines for every country the FCR, the primary control reserve. So this is an exogenous definition of reserve. Or it can be endogenously calculated by time. So for instance, we can let times to find which is our largest grid element in our energy system, and then apply this as the reserve demand. And it can be also a weighted sum of exogenous and endogenous. So this, before going to the equation, these are the two parameters that we need here. The BS DEM-TET VEDA parameter will be used for defining a deterministic reserve demand. It takes an identifier dpar, which is if it is exogen, then it means that the reserve demand is given exogenous. If it has weight of maximum system imbalance, then means that the contribution of the largest grid element needs to be considered and the demand is endogenously calculated. And of course, similarly to the process CAPACT, which relates the capacity to activity, there is also a balancing service capacity to activity to connect the capacity and commodity flow units for the reserve commodities. This is, I'm not going to give a lot of equations, only the most important ones, and this is a quite important one, how the demand, the deterministic component of the demand is calculated. So as you can see here, this equation says that the demand for balancing services, deterministic, should be greater or equal to the exogenously defined deterministic demand. This BC here, maybe here. This BC here is this BC CAPACT, plus the endogenous deterministic demand specified as a weight of the maximum component of the grid And here, what is happening is that this equation, this inequality, is repeated several times, each time for every process that has been either defined by the user that should contribute into this calculation of the largest grid element. So here the user specifies that nuclear, hydro, pump storage participate into, and for instance, an interconnector should participate into this calculation. In that case, this equation, this inequality repeats 4 times, and it satisfies, of course, with the maximum. And if the process time slice is different than the time slice of the reserve, then the Fmax is adjusted accordingly. So this equation here applies to the time slices where the reserve is defined. And if one process operates at a higher time slice level, then this AF max becomes, let's say, the average. And how this can be implemented. So I repeat here this strange equation. So what we have to do first is to use the GRGenMap VEDA parameter in order to say to times which processes, here a nuclear process and a grid interconnector, participate into the identification of the largest grid element. So in this case, what times will do, we'll see what is larger. It's the nuclear, or it's the nuclear power plants, or the grid interconnectors. This implies that this inequality here, it will be repeated 2 times. One with var and cap on nuclear, and another one on var and cap on grid. It follows that if the grid, for instance, is larger than nuclear, the second inequality becomes binding, and the first one becomes redundant. This is how the maximum largest component is considered into this equation. And of course, we don't want to put the reserve equals to the maximum. We can also apply a weight on that. We can derate it. And this is happening here. With this parameter, as we saw before, with this parameter, we say that the weight of the largest grid element on this calculation will be 10%. So if the nuclear power plant that we lose is 1.5 gigawatt, this weight applies here and says that all this thing is 150 megawatt. And if we need to put the exogenous, we use the parameter BSDEM det. We specify for which reserve we define it. We give exogen and the amount in this case in gigawatts. So this here says that my deterministic demand of reserve is equal, should be greater or equal to exogenous, which is 60. I take the FECR plus 10% of the maximum capacity between a nuclear power plant and a grid interconnector. I hope it's clear a little bit. Now that was the easy one. Now comes the probabilistic component of the demand. And this is based on user-defined forecast errors, wind solar production. The forecast errors, we assume here that are random variables and that they follow a standard normal distribution. So this is the process here. The user just needs to specify how much is this error as a standard deviation, 3%, 5%, 2%. And we take the assumption here that each forecast error that the user specify is a normal distribution. And this is a standard normal distribution with mean 0 and a standard deviation equal to the forecast error in order to simplify the calculations. And then we join, we convolute these three probability distributions, and we create the joint probability distribution. And the only thing that we have to do then is just to move 3 standard deviation from to this side to define the positive reserve requirement, or 3 standard deviations left to define the negative reserve requirement. This is the formula. So here it says that the variable that gives the demand for balancing services according to the probabilistic component equals 3 times 3 standard deviations. And here is the formula for joining these 3 probability distributions, where sigma here is the forecast error that, or the standard deviation that each one of them has, and var RLD square is actually the power. So I don't have it, but the problem here is that this is a non-linear because it has the square root. So what we do in times, we linearize it. We take the upward part. So we say it's 3 times the sum. So we take out the square root, we take out the square here and the square from here. And then because this doesn't match exactly this formula, we have an additional scaling factor if needed to go to a little bit to correct the approximation. So times has this equation here. Let's see how we can define this. So I repeat here the demand equation for the probabilistic. So we need just 2 parameters, the sigma, which is here, and this is the forecast error regarding a variation k. This means if it is the forecast error on wind, k equals wind, or it is the solar, or it's the demand, and etc. And the delta, which is this adjustment that we do here in order to make a better approximation. And it's pretty straightforward, I hope. So this goes like the following. Let's focus again on the commodity, which is AFRR plus, and this is the secondary positive reserve. This is how we defined it. We define the parameter BS sigma, and here as another index, I write something like demand system imbalances. And I say that this sigma applies to this time slice, and it is 1.7%. Basically, it's not a good idea to define here a time slice. It's better to have it at an annual basis, and then this goes to the time slices. But I just want to say here that you can define it in any time level of the time slice tree. So this row here defines 1.7% forecast error on the demand. Similarly, this next one defines 1.5% forecast error for a solar system imbalance and 0.8% forecast error for a wind system imbalance. These names here are user defined. You are free to define what the names of your imbalances as you like. You can put whatever you want here. Whatever you put here, times will consider that this is an imbalance. And the next step that you have to do is to say which power plants or which processes contribute to its imbalance that you have defined. So for instance, for the imbalance wind SI, it's the wind process that contributes to this imbalance. And this again is happening with the GR-GenMap Veda parameter, which maps the wind to belong to this system imbalance. Similarly for the solar. And if I have many processes contributing to the same imbalance, I list them one after the other with the GR-GenMap and setting the number 1 here to force the mapping. And of course, optionally, if I'm not very happy with the approximation that this part of the equation does, I can set the data parameter in order to make a better approximation of it. Here, I just have it trivial. I just have it one. The important here is that you are free to define whatever imbalances you want, and whatever names you give for your imbalances should be given into a BS sigma attribute, and the times will take these imbalances into consideration. And then the only thing that you need to do is just to map which processes contribute to its imbalance. How to get these forecast errors? This you can do some historical time series analysis, or you can be based on the literature. An important and a difficult concept here is that there are dependencies between the reserve types, because as I saw before, the secondary reserve is 1 standard deviation, while the tertiary reserve is 2 standard deviations. Sometimes we need to define this, and this depends on how the ancillary services market is configured to the different countries. And if we need to define some such kind of dependencies, that we say here, for instance, that the AFRR is the 60% quantile and MFRR is the 90% quantile, given that we have defined all our rebalances as a standard normal distribution, we can apply a scaling factor lambda in order to establish a ratio between the AFRR and MFRR reserve. Now this looks a little bit complex, so I will come back to that into an example in a while. Important is that whatever is from this point of the distribution until here, it's an FRR reserve, which has 2 types, a secondary, the dark gray, and the tertiary. So, but from here is an FRR reserve. And what the lambda is doing is to define a ratio of how much, or if you want a relationship or a share, how much is the AFRR to the total FRR. So we have another parameter also that it can be used optionally, the dependence factor. And how to do that? It's in VEDA. It is just to identify from the market configuration that we analyze, and this we can find it into the technical documents of the transmission system operators, how much is the share of the secondary and tertiary reserve to the total reserve. Again, I apologize here for my typo. This is plus and this is plus, so this is all positive. Sorry, it's not minus here, it's a plus. This here, this table here establishes a relationships that says that based on this probabilistic approach, the AFRR, the secondary reserve, is 80% of the total positive reserve requirements, and the next 20% is the tertiary reserve. And this can be different for negative and positive. So for instance, here we have another definition that the negative secondary reserve is 70% of the total FRR. While for the primary control reserve, because it's only one, we don't need to specify a lambda. We can have a lambda of 1 because it's only one type. So this lambda only used in order to when we model secondary and tertiary control reserve. If we model only primary reserve, we put 1. If we model only secondary reserve, we put 1. So by going back to the calculation of the total demand, for each reserve type, we have a deterministic component and a probabilistic component, and we can have different combinations of them. For that, there is another parameter of VEDA that, depending if it is 1, 2, or 3, it can take the maximum of the 2, the weighted sum of the 2, or the absolute difference of the two. So you see, it's a little bit complex, that endogenous demand definition, because the ancillary markets are really different between countries and control areas. And we tried here to give some mechanism to be able to define it in a flexible way. So you will not need to use all these parameters for defining the ancillary services for your country. And this is an example of how we can calculate. So after having specified what is the deterministic reserve, what is the probabilistic, and so on, here comes now to combine them and to have the total demand. In that case, in this first example here, we assume that the demand for FCR, the primary control reserve, is given exogenously. So what I select here, I select the weighted sum, where I give the weight of the deterministic component to be equal to 1. In this example, we say that the secondary reserve demand is endogenous and equals to the weighted sum of the probabilistic and deterministic component. Similarly, I select that my demand will be a weighted sum of the two components, where the deterministic component now has a weight of 0.2, which implies that the probabilistic component has a weight of 0.8. And similarly for the negative reserve, the weight of the deterministic component is 0.1, which means that 90% is the probabilistic component. In another case, it could be that the demand for tertiary reserve is endogenous and equals to the max of the two. So what I do here, I just say that my BS omega in this case is equal to 1 to just take the maximum of the two. So let's go now to the commodity balance equations for reserve. The reserve commodities, as any other commodity in times, can be defined in any levels of the time slice tree. The bounds, lower effects and 10, are also applied to the reserve. The low-end effects enforce the market balance at the commodity time slice only, while the N enforce the commodity market balance to the finest time slice. This is a little bit complex. This means that the demand of the time slice below the commodity time slice, so let's say that I have both seasonal and day-night levels in my time slice tree, and I define the reserve demand at the seasonal level. If I use N in the COMLIM, in the commodity sense balance, then means that the commodity balance will generate it in the seasonal, but at the same time, it will require that the the supply-demand balance on the lower level of time slices will be equal to the maximum seasonal balance. So that is the endogenous demand. It is a little bit complex. It has 5 key parameters to be defined depending on the configuration. The supply is simpler. The supply is simpler. The supply can be provided, the reserve can be provided by supply processes, storages, and demand processes. When the capacity of a storage is expressed as a power, which means that we model the storage with the NKPF C parameter, this is commonly used for pump storages, then the storage is considered to be a supply process. So whatever is formulated for supply process applies also for the storages. But if the storage capacity is expressed as energy, which means that the capacity of the storage is bounded by the stored energy, then we need to take the other approach where we need to take into consideration how much energy needs the storage to have in order to be able to charge to the provision of the power, to the power that needs to be provided, plus to have enough energy to continue providing this power for a given time. So for the reserve provision from supply processes, there are only two parameters that one can use. The most important of the two is the BSR max. The BSR max is the maximum contribution of a process to the reserve provision of a given type and considers the ramping rate and the duration of the reserve provision. And you can see here the example. If I have a call process in my model in which I have identified an hourly ramping rate, 30%, and this process is contracted, needs to provide secondary reserve for 7.5 minutes, then what I do here is that I set the BSR max equal to 30% divided by 60 minutes, multiplied by 7.5 minutes, and this becomes 0.0375. So this means that 3.7% of the available capacity of the process can be contracted because of the constraint that it has on the ramping rate can be contracted for reserve provision. And how you find the 7.5 minutes, this is again from the configuration of the ancillary services market of its country. Important is, and you can see here some example, important is that the BSR max needs to be higher for the slower reserves. So the slower the reserve is, more capacity is available to provide it. If we don't set the BSR max for a process, the process does not participate in the ancillary services markets. If a storage is modeled with NKFC, so the capacity of the storage is expressed on power units, the BSR max needs to be defined. This implies that for the supply processes, because the BSR max relates to the ramping rates and also implicitly to the minimum stable operating levels, this means that these two VEDA parameters for minimum stable operating level and maximum up and down ramping rates needs also to be defined. Otherwise, the equations do not work. The same holds for the reserve provision for demand processes. So it's again the BSR max that defines that a demand process needs to go into the reserve market. Of course, a demand process provides negative reserve and doesn't have a ramping on minimum stable operating level. So here, the BSR max just applies as a percentage on the available capacity of the demand process. And for storages where the storage levels are bounded by capacity, so for storages where the capacity is expressed in energy units, in petajoules, then we have one parameter to enable the provision of ancillary services from these processes. This parameter is called balancing services storage time. And it takes a bound here, which if it is lower, this corresponds to the time required for the process to ramp up. So it's the time from this point until here. And if it is given as up, this bound here, this corresponds to the duration. It's the difference between this time and that one. So we just give the time. And oh, here is a very bad picture. And here is how we define them into VEDA. So I have here my process. This is a gas turbine combined cycle where I assume that it has a 50% hourly ramping rate and will be contracted. It's going to the AFRR, to the secondary reserve market, which needs to be provided for 7.5 minutes. So 50% ramping rate divided by 60 multiplied by 7.5 gives me 5% contribution. And pump storage, but here my pump storage is modeled with the capacity expressed in power units. I use the NKFC. So I use again the BSR max here, while for a battery storage, which is modeled by where in its modeling we consider that the capacity is expressed in energy units. Then we enable the BSS time, which is how much time needs to charge, needs to ramp up, and for how much time needs to provide the reserve. There is also another feature that comes with this extension, which is the maintenance and outages of the power plants. So currently in times when we account for maintenance and outages, this is optional, I have to say, and this doesn't need to be enabled for this extension, but it's implemented in this extension. So it's currently in times, we just derate the nameplate capacity by using an availability factor less than 1. We have now also the option to capture the discrete character of the maintenance by specifying how long is this maintenance period. And then the times can also optimize when to enter this process into a maintenance. So if we enable this parameter here, the balancing services maintenance, which is defined over region, vintage, process, and time slice, we instruct times that it can do an endogenous maintenance scheduling. And what we give here is we give how many hours this maintenance lasts. If this maintenance is more than 24 hours, this applies to the whole weekly level or to the whole season level. It depends how the time slice tree is defined. And this means that the power plant will not be available for certain time slices. So this is complementary, if you want, to the NCAP-AF. And another extension that came with this, but also is on the normal version of times. So for that, for this particular one, you don't need to enable the balancing services, while for the previous one, you need to enable it. This is an approximation of the storage degradation due to the extensive cycling. So there is a parameter which is called SDG max cycles, which is the maximum numbers of cycles for a storage process. It has a particular application when we are considering especially batteries in electric cars, and I'm going to give an example how this is working. So let's say that the N capacity is 1 gigawatt hour. This is my installed capacity of this is my capacity of batteries. Okay, 1 gigawatt hour obviously is not for one electric car. The lifetime is 10 years, and the maximum cycles are 4,000. If let's say that I have 2 seasons in my time slice tree, season 1 and season 2, where the first season I have it very nicely on an hourly level, while the second season has 6 time slices, S1, S2, S3, S4, S5, and S6, which means that each time slice here in season 2 corresponds to 6 hours in a day. And you can see here how times schedule this battery of electric cars. So it charges the car during the night in season 1 and discharging the car during the peak hours, or when people, let's say, are coming home after the work, whatever, and the same on season 2. And let's see a little bit what is happening here. So in the Varecine, what is coming into the process over the whole year in both seasons is 1.8 petajoules. This is 500 gigawatt hours. What is come out is 450 gigawatt hours. Based on the fact that this storage operates maximum 4,000 cycles per year and lives 10 years, this means that on average, the targeted cycles per year is 40 gigawatt, is 4,000 divided by 10. This corresponds to 40 cycles. And this one here is the capacity that I have from the storage. So if I have to respect the targeted cycles per year, this means that this storage needs to do 40 gigawatt hours per year output. But my current cycling per year is 500 gigawatt hours divided by the lifetime 10. So my current cycling per year is 50 gigawatt hours, which means that I have an excess cycling of 50 divided by 40, 1.25, which means that Times needs to install 25% of this capacity. So what Times is doing now, it invests an additional 0.25 gigawatt hours of this storage because this storage does an excessive cycling. So I conclude with a working example. So this is a simple res for some testing purposes. Let's assume that we have one electricity demand here. And we have two gas processes, an open cycle and a combined cycle, a hydro storage dam, a nuclear, a PV, and a wind. Also, we have a battery and a pump hydro storage. And this is my grid, transmission distribution that distributes my electricity generation to my demand. And let's look a little bit down here first. Let's say that these are my power plants. This is my installed capacities, my minimum operating levels, my hourly ramping rates, and my minimum online and offline times. And here are my demands. So I have a total demand here of 60 terawatt hours or 10.7 gigawatt peak. And these are the demands that I have for the reserves. This is the durations of the reserves that I need to provide. So FCR, I need to provide it for half a minute, AFRR for 7.5 minutes, and MFRR for 15 minutes. So then I need to know what is my ancillary service market configuration. So in this case here, we take some assumptions based on the country that we're modeling. So according to this ancillary service market configuration, the FCR type of reserve should be exogenously given, and it's set to 90 megawatts. The AFRR type of reserve should take into account the loss of largest grid element and the probabilistic assessment. So it's a weighted sum between deterministic and probabilistic. And AFRR is defined at the 7% quantile of the FRR distribution. MFRR, again, is a weighted sum between a deterministic and probabilistic assessment and is defined at the 99% quantile. This is what is given to me, which means that the dependency factor between AFRR and FRR is equal to 0.8 based on these two quantiles. And here are my forecasts. The solar forecast is 1.5%, the wind forecast error is 0.8%, and my demand forecast error is 1.7%. So I have all the numbers for the parameters that I need. And the parameters that I need is my N capacity, my act time to set the minimum online offline times, and the ramping rates, and the minimum stable operating level. And then I need to define the reserve commodities. I need to specify with the omega if the reserve demand function is a weighted sum, yes or not. Here is a weighted sum. I need the dem det to specify how much is the deterministic component. It's 90 megawatt. The sigma to specify the errors, the forecast errors that I have. The lambda to specify the relationship between AFRR and MFRR, which is 0.8% as we saw before. And the BSR max to specify the contribution of its technology in reserve based on how long this reserve should be provided and how much is the ramping rate. And I put that into Veda as I saw before in this example. And here I have 3 scenarios: a base scenario, a scenario where I don't model ancillary markets, but I have only a peak constraint of 30%, and a scenario where I don't model a peak constraint, but I only have ancillary markets. So my first scenario is no peak constraint, no ancillary markets. The second scenario is no ancillary markets, a peak constraint of 30%. And the third scenario is no peak constraint, ancillary markets, just to show to you how it works. And this is the installed capacity in order to satisfy the demand that I have, by assuming that for the peak 30% scenario, the contribution to peak reserve from hydropower is derated to 60% and from pump storage to 50%, while there is no contribution to peak reserve from solar and wind. And we can see, of course, that we don't have in the base and in the peak 30%, we don't have investment on gas open cycle. So we miss a flexibility option here. This flexibility option, however, comes when we enable the ancillary markets extension. So this is one altering in the investment decision, that it can enable investments in additional flexibility. And the results on operational decision by comparing the peak 30% scenario. Of course, the base and peak 30% scenario do not have differences in the operational decisions, because the peak constraint affects only the installed capacity. The model is free not to use at all this capacity. So they have the same operational decisions. And here is the ancillary market scenario, the scenario where we have the ancillary markets, but we don't have the peak constraint. And we can see, first of all, the following, that we have the dispatch also of the gas open cycle. So the flexibility option is not only invested in the ancillary services, but also is used, because it takes, it better captures the remuneration of the flexibility capacity in the ancillary services market. And of course, it can lead to a smoother and perhaps more realistic, as you can see here, dispatch profile, because additional operating and technical constraints are now considered. And my last example that I want to say to show to you is this extension on the capacity under maintenance. So here we say that let's force a maintenance of up to 30% of the installed gas combined cycle capacity for 5 hours. So this means that our power plants, our gas turbines combined cycle power plants, needs to shut down for 5 hours for maintenance. Of course, I use here 5 hours because I wanted to scale to you to 24 hours. The example, if it is more, as I said before, 24 hours, then applies to the upper seasonal level of the time slice 3. And I set my two parameters. Here I say here that in this particular example, that I want this maintenance to happen in summer. I want this maintenance to happen in summer, but I don't know in which 5 hours. So you are free to choose in which 5 hours. Times is free to choose in which time, in which 5 hours this power plant will go out. So what I do here is, first of all, because I want this to be in summer. This is my assumption. Of course, I'm not obliged to say that this should happen to summer. But if I want to specify a particular season, then I say with NKPEFS, I derate first the gas capacity to 70%, because 30% in summer will not be available. It will be under maintenance. And then I'm saying here, of course, this 70% here depends always how you model the time slice tree. Here we say, here I take the assumption that the season is 1 day also. And this BS maint, this new parameter, is set to 5 hours. And what times is doing? It finds by itself when to do the maintenance, and the maintenance of 5 hours occurs at a specific time slices. So this is actually should go from here. You can imagine that this faults, this is repeated, and times does the following. It starts shutting down the power plants in order to increase the capacity that comes into maintenance. Yes, so that is all from my side, and I hope that you get a feeling how this works. There is more information and more examples on the balancing services documentation, which is available to the ETSAP website. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vangelis, for all this. I can see you're really tired after talking for all this time. So, are there any questions? I cannot see anything on the chat. Vanilla, would you like to ask something? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, so thank you for your presentation, Vangelos. My question is maybe reflecting that I haven't understood it all, but when you put a demand forecast error on demand, does it have to be on, because demand in times models is often not on electricity, it's on heat or transport needs. So do you put the forecast errors on the end use demand or on the electricity demand?
An electricity demand.
Could it be possible to? Because,
yes, you can put it also on the other one. Yeah.
But does it make sense?
If it is applied, sorry, let me see. No, it is applied to the electricity demand. You put it to the demand process. You put it to the demand. So if the electricity demand, if the end use demand is specified by is satisfied by several electricity processes, then it will take into account what input is required for this particular processes. Because we map which processes contribute to the demand imbalance. There is a mapping. Yeah. So you say, for instance, that I have a heating demand, and I have also a lighting demand, and I have also a mobility demand. And for the heating demand, I have heat pumps. And for the lighting demand, I have bulbs. And for the mobility demand, I have cars. So you specify that my demand forecast is based on the aggregation of the heat pump, of the lighting bulb, and of the electric car. So you don't put it to the process of the end use demand, but rather you apply your forecast. You say that my forecast on the demand is, let's say, 2%. You give 2% forecast on the demand, but then through the GR/GenMap parameter, you say to times which processes should be considered into the calculation of this forecast.
Yeah, so I map the electricity consuming processes.
Right. So you map the electricity consuming processes. So you say, you define an imbalance. You say, this is my system imbalance, demand system imbalance, whatever name you want. You say the error for this imbalance, the forecast error is 3%. And then you list all your electricity consuming processes that contribute to this imbalance.
I have one last question then, because this forecast error, I guess it's scenario dependent. So how do you when you do this, it depends on how much new industry you get and how much electrification and you understand my question? I think your forecast error depends on the development of the energy system.
Right. This is currently that is not supported. The forecast error to be endogenous. You have to pre-specify it, but you have the option, of course, to change it over time. But everything should be exogenous. Otherwise, it's non-linear.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, Vangelis, what happens in the case of a multi-regional model then?
Yes. So for a multi-regional model, there is the possibility for the different regions to define, first of all, the ancillary market demands, the ancillary services demands, according to the different rules that the regions apply, because all parameters are regional dependent. And you can also consider the fact that this flexibility can also be traded. So you can also have trade processes which are defined on the reserve commodity and exchange this reserve commodity between the regions. If you don't want to trade, then one can also specify the ancillary services markets for inside the region. And if one wants to consider also the cross-border interconnectors on that, you are free to put them also into this contribution by specifying the parameter BSR max, which says how much will be this maximum contribution of this process.
So I was thinking basically what you were talking about, the NSOE region providing the primary service, basically. So this could be done in a multi-regional EU level model. So that commodity can be traded. So we need special trades processes for this commodity between the countries, right?
Right. As you model any other trade.
Any other trade. Okay.
As you model other trade.
You could model the other the secondary level and so on a national level.
On a national level, yes. The limitation is that you cannot give the FCR if it is to give it for the whole region to be endogenous calculated and attributed then to the different countries. This is quite complex. You can do that with user constraints because user constraints are supported, but it will become quite complex. It is easier to assume that it is 3 gigawatts, let's say, for NSOE. I mean, if you start with that, better to take the first approach, the simple approach that is 3 gigawatts. And yes, and then you model it so that you don't make it fully endogenous. You can do it, but it's complex.
Yeah, okay. No, it's easier if it's deterministic, so you can actually trade. Yeah. And what about if it is a national multi-regional model? So it's one country, so the same rules.
And it has different control areas, let's say.
Yeah.
Yeah, this the ancillary services are specified per control area. So if a country like Germany, for instance, which has, I don't remember, 2 or 3 control areas, you have a different ancillary services for each control area. So it goes again as a multi-regional model. You can trade between these control areas.
And then you could trade each commodity separately. So the positive and the negative, each one, the FCR, the AFRR, the MFRR, positive, negative. So if you have everything, it's what, 3 times 2. So yes. 6 commodities they have to be traded. Okay.
Yes. Yes. These reserves are usually 6 commodities. Mm-hmm. Yes.
There are 2 questions in the chat. I don't think you see them.
What is the difference between normal optimization, reducing output, compared to the new maintenance feature? Yeah, it is. The difference is that the times can just specify when to do the maintenance, while by derating the output, what we have is that we apply this flat over a day, let's say, and while with this feature, the power plant is only shut down for specific hours. So the model has a little bit more flexibility when to do the maintenance, and it's not a flat rate that just derates the capacity. I hope that I answered this. And is the example model available to the community to test and understand? The example model is available in the documentation, is explained very detailed there, much more detail of what I explained at the moment. Of course, it is not given as a VEDA front-end Excel file, but I guess it's quite straightforward to how to set up the parameters. But if I show,
Would it be possible to share these templates again? I mean,
yeah, I can. I wanted I wanted to have them there, but somehow I couldn't find them. But I will upload it. I will send it to you, George, and then you can upload it to the website together with the documentation.
Yeah, that would be great. And also, you could upload it together with this presentation, because this will go on the website under the webinars as well. So
I have to correct some typos that I have.
Correct the typos.
Sorry.
And you can share it with me.
I will do that.
Yeah.
And I will be happy if people start using that, because maybe we can find also some errors into the implementation or some shortcomings. It's also this possible. And yeah, of course, it increases the size of model, that we have to have it into consideration.
Yeah, it's always the case. Great. Okay, so if you could provide the corrected slides plus the demo model templates, it would be great. So we will upload everything on our website. And of course, this recording will go on YouTube channel as well. So you could watch it again and again, as many times as you want.
The difficulty is only how to specify the demand. If one doesn't want to have this demand endogenous, you don't need to go into all these details with probabilities, forecast errors, and so on. You just specify, this is my exogenous demand that I need to satisfy, and then you let the system play. I think this is the first thing. If you want to try this, I recommend that you just assume that the demand for reserve is exogenous. And then you do, how much does it increase the running time? No, okay, it is, I cannot remember, Pernilla, I'm sorry. But it's not prohibited. It's not something which is not, you cannot do it. No. It's not like the dispatching. It doesn't need all the dispatching. It takes only 2 or 3 parameters out of it.
Okay, so it doesn't need to do the dispatching part. It just takes only the parameters it needs.
It needs only the minimum stable operating level and the wrapping rates. This is the absolutely minimum that you need from the dispatching.
Great.
It doesn't need all the features.
Okay, great. So if we don't have any other questions, I think we can stop it here.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I know that it's heavy. As always, new extensions of times are heavy. I hope with the example and the presentation and the documentation that it will become clearer, and I hope that it will be useful. Thanks a lot.
So, thank you for your time, Bageli. Thanks for giving all this detailed presentation, and I'm waiting for the presentation to put it on the website. Okay,
right.
so
I will send it immediately. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend.
Have a nice weekend, and we'll have the next webinar next month. So titles soon to be announced. We'll see what will come. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.